The Halbrook estate had always been a monument to silence, but tonight the silence felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Mrs. Adelaide Sterling stood at the mahogany sideboard of the grand dining hall, her fingers tracing the rim of a crystal flute. At 70, her posture remained as rigid as the steel mills that had built her family's fortune. She watched the reflection of the room in the darkened windowpane, the glittering chandeliers, the velvet drapes, and the movement of the woman standing just a few feet behind her. Elena. Her daughter-in-law was a masterpiece of careful construction. Tonight, she wore a dress of pale ivory silk that clung to her with the grace of a second skin. Her hair was swept back into a sleek, tight knot, revealing a face that was perpetually serene, perpetually helpful. To the outside world, Elena was the savior of the Sterling family. The devoted wife who had stabilized Adelaide's son, Julian, and the doting mother who had brought life back into the cold halls of the manor. But Adelaide knew better. She had spent 40 years navigating boardrooms where men hid daggers behind spreadsheets. She knew the scent of ambition when it was masked by expensive perfume. The gala was a success, mother, Elena said. Her voice was melodic, carrying that practiced softness that made everyone else in the room feel unnecessarily loud. The investors were particularly impressed with Julian's presentation. They see him as the future of Sterling Industrial. Finally, Adelaide didn't turn around. Julian is the face of the future, Elena. But he has never been the spine of this company. We both know who wrote that presentation. A small, sharp silence followed. Adelaide could almost hear the gears turning in Elena's head, deciding which mask to wear. I'm merely a supportive wife, Elena replied, stepping closer. The clicking of her heels on the marble floor sounded like a countdown. I want what is best for the family. Just as you do. Though I suppose our definitions of best have begun to diverge. Adelaide finally turned. She met Elena's gaze, a pale, icy blue that gave nothing away. My definition is simple: survival. I have watched this company weather recessions, scandals, and wars. I will not watch it be dismantled by someone who treats it like a personal jewelry box. Elena smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator who had realized the cage door was unlocked. You've become paranoid, mother. The doctors call it age-related cognitive decline. The board calls it inflexibility. Julian just calls it sad. The remark hit with the precision of a scalpel. Adelaide felt a flicker of heat in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. She set the crystal glass down with a deliberate, steady hand. Is that what you're telling him? Between the whispers in bed and the concerned phone calls to the family physician. I don't have to tell him anything, Elena whispered, leaning in so close that Adelaide could smell the faint, metallic scent of her lipstick. I just have to let him watch you. Every time you misplace your keys, the keys I moved, or every time you forget a meeting, the meeting I deleted from your calendar. He sees the matriarch crumbling. It's a tragedy, really. But don't worry. I'll be here to catch the pieces. Adelaide felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was a realization of the scale of the trap. This wasn't just about money. It was a systematic erasure of her competence. Elena wasn't stealing the company. She was stealing Adelaide's reality. You think you've won because you've fooled a boy who was always too weak to see the truth, Adelaide said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibrato. But Julian isn't the only one with a vote on the trust. Tomorrow morning, I'm meeting with the executors. The Sterling Foundation will become the sole beneficiary of the estate upon my death. You and Julian will have your allowance, your cars, and your clothes. But you will never own the ink on the contracts. Elena's expression didn't shatter. It solidified. The feigned softness vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness that reminded Adelaide of the winter frost. Tomorrow morning? Elena asked softly. That's a long time from now, Adelaide. A lot can happen in the dark. Are you threatening me in my own home? Threatening? No. I'm observing, Elena said, reaching out to straighten a stray hair on Adelaide's shoulder. The gesture was terrifyingly intimate. You've always said that a house is only as strong as its foundation. But you forgot that foundations are buried. They're hidden in the dirt where no one looks. Elena pulled back. her mask of the perfect daughter-in-law snapping back into place as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. Julian entered, loosening his tie, his face flushed with the pride of a man who didn't realize he was a puppet. "There you two are," Julian said, looking between them. He noticed the tension but, as usual, misinterpreted it. "Mother, you look tired. You should really listen to Elena and start taking those new supplements the doctor sent over. You've been looking frail." Adelaide looked at her son, her only child, and saw the reflection of Elena's handiwork. He didn't see a formidable CEO, he saw a liability. "I'm fine, Julian," Adelaide said, her voice sounding older than she felt. "She's just overwhelmed by the excitement of the night," Elena said, gliding over to Julian and tucking her arm into his. She looked back at Adelaide over her shoulder, her eyes gleaming with a hidden lethal promise. "Go up to bed, mother. Rest. You have a very big day tomorrow. We wouldn't want you to be confused." As they walked away, their voices fading into the depths of the mansion, Adelaide stood alone in the center of the vast, hollow room. She looked at the portrait of her late husband hanging above the fireplace. He had always told her that the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one across the battlefield, but the one sitting at your table. She reached into her pocket and felt the small, brass key to the safe in her study. Inside was the draft of the new will. She needed to survive until 9 a.m. She turned off the chandelier, plunging the room into darkness. But as she climbed the stairs, the shadows seemed to move with her. The house, once her fortress, now felt like a labyrinth designed to swallow her whole. Behind the closed doors of the guest wing, she heard the faint, muffled sound of a child laughing. Her grandson, the only innocent thing left in this bloodline. She didn't know that in the room next door, Elena was already opening a laptop, her fingers flying across the keys as she sent a single, encrypted message to a contact she had labeled the architect. The message read, "Asterisk, the timeline has moved up. Tonight. Asterisk." Adelaide reached her bedroom and locked the door. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat by the window, watching the gates of the estate, waiting for a morning that felt 1,000 years away. She was the queen of an empire, but tonight, she was just a woman trapped in a cage of gold and silk, listening to the silence of a house that was no longer hers. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 3 a.m., each chime echoing through the Halbrook estate like a funeral knell. Adelaide sat in the wingback chair by her bedroom window, the moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows across the Persian rug. She hadn't undressed. She hadn't even closed her eyes. In this house, sleep was no longer a luxury, it was a vulnerability. She stood up, her joints stiff from the cold, and moved toward her heavy oak desk. From a hidden compartment, she pulled out a small digital recorder. She had started recording everything. Conversations, thoughts, even the mundane details of her day. It was her only defense against the fog Elena was trying to wrap around her mind. "March 14th, she whispered into the device. "Elena has moved from psychological manipulation to direct threats." She intercepted the call to the executors. "I have 6 hours until the meeting. If I do not make it to that office, the empire falls to a woman who views people as disposable assets." A floorboard creaked outside her door. Adelaide froze. She clicked the recorder off and slid it into the waistband of her skirt. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the distinct rhythmic sound of breathing, soft, steady, and terrifyingly close, came from the other side of the wood. "Mother? Are you still awake?" It was Julian. But the voice was wrong. It lacked the warmth of a son. It was filtered through the exhaustion and irritation that Elena had been cultivating in him for months. Adelaide didn't answer. She watched the brass handle of the door turn slowly. It stopped when the lock engaged. A frustrated sigh followed, then the sound of retreating footsteps. She knew she couldn't stay in the room. If Elena was moving the timeline up, the bedroom was a dead end. She needed to get to the study downstairs to retrieve the hard copies of the financial audits. The ones that proved Elena had been funneling money into offshore accounts under Julian's name. Taking a deep breath, Adelaide unlocked her door and slipped into the hallway. The mansion felt different in the dark. The portraits of ancestors seemed to watch her with judging eyes, their legacies hanging in the balance. She navigated the corridors by memory, avoiding the spots where the wood groaned. As she reached the top of the grand staircase, she saw a flicker of light from the kitchen below. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall, peering through the balusters. Elena was there, sitting at the island with a laptop open. Beside her stood a man Adelaide didn't recognize, tall, dressed in a nondescript dark uniform. They weren't speaking. They were looking at a tablet that displayed the house's security grid. "The cameras in the north wing are looped," the man whispered. His voice was clinical, devoid of emotion. "You have a 40-minute window before the system does an auto-sync." "And the boy?" Elena asked. Her voice was cold, stripped of the melodic sweetness she used in the light of day. "He's sound asleep. The sedative in the juice worked perfectly." Adelaide felt a surge of nausea. Elena was drugging her own son, Adelaide's grandson, to facilitate whatever nightmare she was weaving. "Good," Elena said, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the marble countertop. "My husband thinks his mother is losing her mind. Tonight, I need him to believe she's lost her soul. When the police find the note, I want there to be no doubt. She didn't just want the money. She wanted to punish him for choosing me. And the abduction? Stage it in the garden. Use the coat I took from her closet. The footage needs to be grainy enough to hide my face, but clear enough to show her silhouette. Once the boy is at the safe house, I'll return here and play the hysterical mother. Julian will do the rest. He'll sign anything to get his son back, including the power of attorney." Adelaide realized then that her life was worth more to Elena as a villain than as a corpse. If Adelaide died now, there would be an investigation. But if Adelaide was framed for kidnapping her own grandson in a fit of senile rage, she would be institutionalized, and the fortune would fall into Elena's lap without a single legal hurdle. She had to get out. She had to get to the phone in the study, the one line that wasn't routed through the house's smart hub. She retreated into the shadows of the upper gallery, her mind racing. She couldn't go back to her room. She began to move toward the back service stairs, the ones used by the staff. They were narrow and steep, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain. Halfway down, she heard a sound that stopped her blood. Asterisk clack. 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 Asterisk. The sound of Elena's heels on the marble. She was moving toward the stairs. Adelaide ducked into the small pantry off the service hall, pulling the door shut until only a sliver of light remained. She held her breath, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle the sound of her gasping lungs. The footsteps stopped right outside the pantry door. "I know you're out here, Adelaide," Elena said, her voice echoing strangely in the small space. It was the voice of a cat toys with a mouse. "I saw the light under your door go out. I know you heard us. You were always so curious, weren't you?" Adelaide squeezed her eyes shut. She felt the digital recorder in her waistband. "It's all on here," she thought. "The plan, the voice, the treason. You think you're the architect of this family," Elena continued, her shadow falling across the floor. "But you're just the old stone that needs to be cleared away for the new build. Julian doesn't love you anymore. He pities you. And pity is just a slow way of saying goodbye." A hand touched the pantry door handle. Adelaide looked around frantically. In the corner of the pantry was the small dumbwaiter used to send linens up to the second floor. It was cramped, designed for laundry, not a woman of her age. But it was the only way out. She scrambled into the small wooden box, pulling the manual ropes with every ounce of strength she possessed. The pulley groaned. A sound like a scream in the quiet house. The pantry door swung open just as the dumbwaiter vanished into the shaft. Adelaide descended in total darkness, the rough hemp ropes burning her palms. She landed in the basement laundry room with a bone-jarring thud. She crawled out, gasping for air, her silk blouse torn and stained with dust. She wasn't safe yet. The basement had an exit to the coal cellar, which led to the gardens. If she could reach the gardener's cottage, he had a truck. He had been loyal to her husband for 30 years. But as she pushed open the heavy wooden door to the cellar, she saw a figure standing in the moonlight near the rose bushes. It was the man in the dark uniform, and in his arms, wrapped in a blanket, was the limp form of her grandson. Adelaide's resolve broke. She didn't think about the trust, the audits, or the empire. She only saw the child. "Stop!" she cried out, her voice cracking. The man turned. He didn't look surprised. He looked at his watch. From the balcony above, Elena looked down, a glass of wine in her hand. The moonlight caught the emerald on her finger, the one Adelaide's husband had given her on their 20th anniversary. Right on time, mother, Elena called out, her voice filled with a terrifying, triumphant joy. Smile for the cameras. The kidnapping has officially begun. Adelaide looked up and saw the red light of the security camera blinking in the ivy. She realized then that she hadn't escaped the trap. She had walked right into the center of it. The rain began as a fine mist, turning the manicured gardens of the Sterling estate into a blurred landscape of charcoal and silver. Adelaide stood paralyzed by the cellar door, her breath hitching in her chest as she watched the man in the dark uniform adjust his grip on her grandson. The boy was too still. The sight of his small, limp arm hanging from the blanket was a visceral terror that overrode every corporate instinct Adelaide possessed. Put him down, she commanded, though her voice lacked its usual iron. It sounded thin, fragile, like dry parchment tearing in the wind. From the balcony, Elena leaned forward, her silhouette framed by the warm, amber light of the master suite. A light that felt like a mockery of the cold darkness below. He's perfectly safe, mother. For now. He's just sleeping. You know how children are. They can sleep through anything. Even their own grandmother's descent into madness. I have a recording, Elena, Adelaide gritted out, her hand tightening around the small device in her waistband. I heard everything. The loop cameras. The sedatives. The plan to frame me. I will go to the police. Elena's laugh was a sharp, brittle sound that cut through the hiss of the rain. The police? Oh, Adelaide. You still think the world operates on truth. Look at yourself. You're shivering in a torn silk blouse in the middle of a coal cellar. You've been wandering the halls at night for weeks. Julian has been documenting every episode. And now the security footage will show you carrying a bundle, which looks remarkably like a child, into the woods at 4 a.m. The man, Adelaide pointed a trembling finger at the shadowy figure. He's right there. He's the evidence. What man? Elena asked, her voice dropping to a whisper of mock concern. She turned her head slightly. I don't see anyone, mother. I only see you. And so will the cameras. As if on cue, the man stepped backward into the deep shadow of the towering yew hedges. The motion was so fluid, so silent, that for a terrifying second, Adelaide doubted her own eyes. The garden lights flickered, a programmed stutter in the electricity, and when they stabilized, the man was gone. The space by the rose bushes was empty. He has him, Adelaide screamed, lunging toward the hedges. Her shoes slipped on the wet grass, and she fell hard, the mud staining her knees. Julian, help. A door slammed upstairs. A moment later, the floodlights of the terrace snapped on, bathing the garden in a harsh, clinical white. Julian appeared at the stone balustrade, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and pity. He was already wrapped in a dressing gown, his hair disheveled. Mother, he cried out, his voice cracking. What are you doing? Where is Leo? Adelaide scrambled to her feet, pointing frantically at the dark wall of the hedges. Julian, a man took him. Elena, she hired him. They're framing me. Look in the hedges, he's right there. Julian looked at the hedges, then back at his mother. He didn't move. He didn't run to search for his son. Instead, he looked at Elena, who was now standing beside him, her hand resting comfortingly on his shoulder. She woke me up, Julian, Elena whispered, loud enough for Adelaide to hear. She was screaming about a man in the house. I went to Leo's room to check on him and he was gone. The window was open. And then I saw her out here, carrying something. I wasn't carrying him. Adelaide shrieked. She took a coat from my closet. She's lying to you, Julian. Look at her. Look at her eyes. Julian stepped back from the edge of the balcony, his expression hardening into something cold and final. Mother, stop it. Just stop. We called the doctor yesterday because we were worried. We thought it was just the stress of the anniversary. But this, to take Leo? To scare us like this? Where is he? I don't have him. Adelaide's voice was a ragged plea. She reached for the recorder. I have proof. Listen to this. Just listen. She pulled the device from her waistband, her fingers numb with cold. She pressed the play button, expecting to hear Elena's cold voice discussing the looped cameras. Instead, there was only static. A loud, rhythmic white noise that drowned out everything. Adelaide stared at the device in horror. She pressed it again. Static. She realized then that the man in the uniform hadn't just been a kidnapper. He was a specialist. A signal jammer. A ghost in the machine. Every electronic defense she thought she had was being erased in real time. "It's empty, isn't it?" Elena said softly from the balcony. "Just like the stories you've been telling. Julian, call the police. Tell them we need an Amber Alert. And tell them my mother-in-law needs an ambulance." "No." Adelaide turned and ran. She didn't run toward the house. She ran toward the gates. She knew the layout of the estate better than anyone living. If she could reach the old stone bridge at the edge of the property, she could get to the main road. There was a gas station a mile away. A public phone. A world outside this gilded cage where Elena's reach might be shorter. The rain turned into a downpour, soaking her to the bone. Every shadow seemed to reach for her. Every snap of a twig was a footstep. She reached the bridge, her lungs burning, her heart erratic. But as she crossed the arch, a pair of headlights cut through the dark. A black sedan was idling at the end of the bridge. The door opened, and the man in the dark uniform stepped out. He wasn't holding Leo anymore. He was holding a heavy, tan trench coat, Adelaide's coat. It was covered in mud and torn at the hem. "Mrs. Sterling," the man said. His voice was polite, the voice of a loyal servant. "You dropped this near the pond, along with the boy's stuffed bear." He held up a small, blue teddy bear. It was Leo's favorite. Adelaide felt the world tilt. The bear was soaking wet. "Where is he?" she whispered, her voice failing. "He's exactly where he needs to be to ensure the papers are signed," the man replied. He stepped closer, tossing the coat over her shoulders. "You should put this on. You're shivering. It wouldn't do for the police to find you looking like a victim. You have a role to play, Adelaide. The Mad Grandmother is a classic for a reason." He reached out and gently took the digital recorder from her limp hand. He dropped it onto the stone road and crushed it beneath the heel of his boot. In the distance, the first wail of a police siren broke through the sound of the rain. Adelaide looked back at the sprawling mansion on the hill. It sat there, glowing with a deceptive warmth, a beautiful monument to a family that had died long ago. She realized then that Elena hadn't just built a trap. She had built a new reality. In that reality, Adelaide was no longer the CEO, the matriarch, or even a grandmother. She was a tragedy. "The sirens are for you, Adelaide," the man said, gesturing toward the approaching blue and red lights. "Make sure you tell them about the man in the shadows. It will make the diagnosis so much easier for the state's doctors." He slipped back into the sedan and reversed into the darkness just as the first patrol car swept onto the bridge. Adelaide stood alone, wrapped in a mud-stained coat that wasn't hers, holding a wet teddy bear. As the world she had built began to lock its doors against her forever, the sirens grew louder, their rhythmic wailing slicing through the torrential rain, until the bridge was flooded with a strobe of red and blue. Adelaide didn't move. She stood like a statue of salt. The mud-caked trench coat heavy on her shoulders, the wet teddy bear clutched to her chest. As the patrol cars screeched to a halt, the officers didn't rush toward her with comfort. They approached with their hands hovering near their holsters, their flashlights blinding her. "Drop the object and put your hands where we can see them." A voice boomed over a megaphone. Adelaide blinked, the rain stinging her eyes. "It's a toy," she whispered, but the wind swallowed her words. She slowly lowered the bear to the wet asphalt and raised her hands. Her fingers were trembling so violently they looked like they belonged to someone else. In the interrogation room an hour later, the atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the chaotic garden. It was windowless, smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Adelaide sat beneath the hum of a fluorescent light that made her skin look translucent, almost ghostly. "Mrs. Sterling," Detective Miller said, leaning back in his chair. He was a man who looked like he had seen too much of the city's underbelly to be impressed by a billionaire's pedigree. "Your son is distraught. Your daughter-in-law is under sedation. And your grandson is missing. We found your coat at the edge of the estate's lake, along with his shoe." "The man," Adelaide said, her voice raspy. "The man on the bridge. He gave me the bear." He had Leo. Miller sighed. A sound of weary patience. We've reviewed the gate footage, Adelaide. There were no cars leaving the estate between 2 a.m. and the time we arrived. The only person on that bridge was you. The sensors didn't pick up any other vehicle. The system was looped, she insisted, leaning forward, her eyes wide with a desperate clarity. Elena, she has a specialist. They know how to bypass the sensors. Please, you have to search the safe houses. Check Elena's offshore accounts. She's been funneling money. Adelaide, Miller interrupted, sliding a folder across the table. This is a report from Dr. Aris, your family physician. It dates back 6 months. It mentions episodes of disorientation, wandering, and paranoia. It says you've been accusing your daughter-in-law of stealing things that were later found in your own room. Adelaide felt the walls of the room closing in. It was a masterpiece. Elena hadn't just planted evidence tonight. She had been gardening this lie for half a year. Every time Adelaide had misplaced her glasses, every time a file had gone missing from her desk, it wasn't age. It was an architect at work. She moved them, Adelaide whispered, more to herself than the detective. She was preparing for this. The security footage from the hallway is the most damning, Miller continued, ignoring her. It shows you entering Leo's room at 3:15 a.m. You emerge 5 minutes later carrying a large bundle. You take the service stairs. You look frantic. I was going to the laundry room. I was trying to escape her. Through the basement? Into a rainstorm? Carrying a bundle that matches the size of a 5-year-old boy. Miller shook his head. Adelaide, if you tell us where he is, we can help you. You're sick. The court will see that. You won't go to prison. You'll go to a facility where you can get the care you need. I am not sick, she roared, her palms slamming against the metal table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. I am the chairman of Sterling Industrial. I built that company while you were still in grade school. Do not speak to me as if I am a broken clock. The door to the interrogation room opened. Julian stood there. He looked shattered, his eyes red-rimmed, his movements sluggish. He didn't look like a man who had won. He looked like a man who had lost his entire world. Behind him, draped in a black shawl that made her look like a mourning widow, was Elena. She didn't enter the room. She stayed in the shadows of the hallway, her face partially obscured. Julian, Adelaide reached out. Julian, tell them. Tell them about the office. Tell them I was going to see the executors. Julian looked at her, and for a fleeting second, Adelaide saw a flash of the boy she had raised. But then he looked at the folder on the table, then at the mud under his mother's fingernails. The executors called me, Mom, he said, his voice hollow. They said you called them yesterday screaming about demons in the boardroom. They were going to suggest a competency hearing on Monday anyway. Adelaide's heart stopped. Elena hadn't just intercepted the call. She had faked a follow-up. She had played both sides of the board. I didn't call them, Adelaide said, her voice barely audible. Julian, please. Look at Elena. Look at her right now. Julian turned his head slightly toward his wife. Elena stepped into the light. She looked devastated. A single tear tracked down her cheek, catching the harsh light of the station. She looked like the picture of grief. We just want him back, Adelaide. Elena sobbed, her voice trembling perfectly. Just tell us where you put him. Was it the lake? Is that why the coat was there? Please, if he's gone, we just need to know. The detective looked at Adelaide with pure disgust. To the law, she wasn't a titan of industry anymore. She was a monster who had drowned her grandson to spite a daughter-in-law she couldn't control. I want my lawyer, Adelaide said, her strength finally failing. She slumped back into the chair, the coldness of the metal seeping into her bones. Your lawyer is downstairs, Miller said. But he's not here for you. He's here to facilitate the temporary transfer of your power of attorney to Julian. Given your condition and the criminal charges, the board has already held an emergency vote. You've been removed, Adelaide. As the officer stood up to lead her to a holding cell, Elena leaned in toward the doorway. For a fraction of a second, the mourning mask slipped. Her eyes met Adelaide's. There was no grief there. There was only the cold, triumphant glow of a victor surveying a conquered territory. Elena mouthed 3 words, silent and sharp. Asterisk, checkmate, mother. Asterisk. Adelaide was led down the hall in handcuffs. Every person she passed, officers, clerks, other lawyers, looked at her with a mixture of horror and fascination. She was the Sterling psycho, the headline that would sell 1 million papers tomorrow. As she was pushed into the cell, the heavy iron door clanging shut with a finality that shook her soul, she realized the true depth of Elena's cruelty. Elena hadn't killed her. She had done something much worse. She had left Adelaide alive to watch as her name, her legacy, and her family were systematically erased, replaced by a lie so perfect that even the truth couldn't break it. In the silence of the cell, Adelaide sat on the thin cot. She had nothing left, no company, no son, no grandson. Only the memory of a man on a bridge, and the phantom weight of a wet teddy bear. She closed her eyes and for the first time in her life, Adelaide Sterling wept. Not for her fortune, but for the boy who was hidden somewhere in the dark, a pawn in a game he was too young to understand. The white walls of the psychiatric evaluation wing were even colder than the interrogation room. Adelaide sat by the narrow window of her private suite, a polite term for a high-security cell, watching the morning sun bleed over the horizon. She had been there for 48 hours. 48 hours since her grandson vanished, since her son renounced her, and since her empire was signed away with a single, shaky stroke of a pen. The door hummed as the electronic lock disengaged. Adelaide didn't turn. She expected a nurse with another tray of chemical sedatives, or perhaps Detective Miller with more questions she couldn't answer. Instead, the scent of expensive, metallic perfume filled the small room. "You look tired, mother," Elena said. Adelaide turned slowly. Elena was dressed in charcoal gray, the color of a mourning dove, yet her eyes were bright, dancing with an adrenaline she no longer felt the need to hide. She carried a small leather briefcase, Adelaide's briefcase, the one that used to hold the Sterling audits. "Where is he?" Adelaide asked, her voice a hollow rasp. Elena pulled a chair over and sat directly across from her, crossing her legs with agonizing grace. "Leo is in Switzerland. He's with a very capable nanny in a villa overlooking Lake Geneva. He thinks he's on a surprise vacation. He's eating chocolate and learning to skip stones. He's perfectly happy, provided I don't tell him what his grandmother tried to do to him." Adelaide felt a surge of nausea. "You'll never get away with this. The police will find the man on the bridge. They'll find the villa." "There is no man on the bridge, Adelaide. There is only a shadow on a grainy security tape that the police have already labeled as your accomplice. And as for the villa, it's owned by a shell company that leads back to a trust you set up 10 years ago. If the boy is found there, it only proves you kidnapped him and hid him in one of your secret properties." Elena smiled, leaning in. "You really were quite brilliant at hiding assets. I've simply repurposed your genius." Adelaide closed her eyes, the weight of the defeat crushing her chest. "Why? I gave you everything. I welcomed you into this family. You gave me a seat at the table, but you kept the knife in your hand." Elena's voice sharpened, the silkiness replaced by a cold, jagged edge. "I watched you patronize Julian for years. I watched you treat me like a pretty ornament that didn't understand the weight of legacy. You thought I was a puppet. But puppets have strings, Adelaide. And if you're smart enough, you can use those strings to strangle the puppeteer." Elena opened the briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is the final voluntary commitment form. If you sign it, I'll bring Leo home tomorrow. He'll tell the police he wandered off and got lost in the woods, and that you found him and tried to protect him, but you were confused. You'll be labeled a hero with a failing mind. You'll live out your days in a very expensive, very comfortable manor in the countryside. No prison. No scandal for the company. And if I don't?" Elena's expression didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "If you don't, Leo stays in Switzerland. Permanently. He will grow up believing his grandmother drowned herself in the lake after trying to kill him. Julian will never speak your name again. And you? You'll spend the rest of your life in a state-run ward for the criminally insane. No private suites. No views of the sunrise. Just the white noise of people who have truly lost their grip on reality." Adelaide looked at the pen Elena placed on the table. It was the same fountain pen Adelaide's husband had used to sign the founding documents of Sterling Industrial. "You've destroyed him," Adelaide whispered. "Julian. He'll never be the man he was. Julian was never a man. He was a shadow of you." Elena stood up, walking toward the window. "I'm doing him a favor. I'm giving him a wife who handles the shadows so he can stay in the light. He's happy, Adelaide. For the first time in his life, he feels like the head of the house. Because I let him believe it." Adelaide looked at the paper. The text was a blur of legal jargon: asterisk incapacitated, transfer of rights, permanent residency. Asterisk. She realized that this was the final twist. Elena didn't want her dead. She wanted her to be the ghost that haunted the Sterling legacy. A cautionary tale of a woman who flew too close to the sun and lost her mind. Adelaide picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake this time. She signed her name for the last time as a free woman. "Good," Elena said, snatching the paper before the ink was even dry. She tucked it into the briefcase and snapped the latches shut. The sound was as final as a guillotine. "I'll send Julian in to say goodbye. Try to look vague. It makes it easier for him." Elena walked to the door, but paused with her hand on the handle. "Oh, and Adelaide? Don't bother looking for that digital recorder. My architect found it in the laundry chute. The static was a nice touch, don't you think? It sounds exactly like a mind falling apart." The door closed. 10 minutes later, Julian entered. He stayed by the door, his face a mask of grief and awkwardness. He didn't come close enough to touch her. "The doctors say the move to the countryside will be good for you, Mom," he said, his voice trembling. "Leo, we found him. He was at the old hunting lodge. He's okay. He said you told him to hide there." Adelaide looked at her son. She saw the lies reflected in his eyes, the comfort he had found in the narrative Elena had written for him. He wanted to believe she was crazy, because it was easier than believing he had married a monster. "I hope you're happy, Julian," Adelaide said quietly. "I just want peace, Mom. That's all any of us want." He turned and left. He didn't look back. Adelaide returned to her seat by the window. She watched the sleek black car, her car, pull away from the hospital gates. She saw the silhouette of Elena in the back seat, already on her phone, likely directing the board of directors, already moving the pieces for the next takeover. Adelaide leaned her head against the cold glass. She had lost her company, her home, and her family. But as she watched the sun rise higher, she felt a strange, cold clarity. Elena thought she had won because she had the papers, the house, and the boy. But Elena had forgotten one thing. Adelaide had built the Halbrook estate. She knew every secret passage, every hidden accounts, and every person Elena had hired. And in the silence of the psychiatric wing, Adelaide began to do what she did best. She began to plan. Good companies aren't destroyed by competition, she thought, her eyes narrowing as she watched the car disappear into the distance. Asterisk, they're destroyed by the wrong people running them. And I have all the time in the world to make sure you're the wrong person, Elena. Asterisk. The story of the Sterling Empire wasn't over. It had just moved into the shadows. And in the shadows, Adelaide Sterling was still the queen.